14. The realization that he was utterly powerless was like the blow of a sledgehammer, yet it was curiously calming as well. No one was forcing him into a decision. He felt no need to stare at the walls of the houses across the courtyard and ponder whether to live with her or not. Teresa had made the decision herself. He went to a restaurant for lunch. He was depressed, but as he ate, his original desperation waned, lost its strength, and soon all that was left was melancholy. Looking back on the years he had spent with her, he came to feel that their story could have had no better ending. If someone had invented the story, this is how he would have had to end it. One day Teresa came to him, uninvited. One day she left the same way. She came with a heavy suitcase. She left with a heavy suitcase. He paid the bill, left the restaurant, and started walking through the streets, his melancholy growing more and more beautiful. He had spent 7 years of life with Teresa, and now he realized those years were more attractive in retrospect than they were when he was living them. His love for Teresa was beautiful, but it was also tiring. He had constantly had to hide things from her, sham, disassemble, make amends, buck her up, calm her down, give her evidence of his feelings, play the defendant to her jealousy, her suffering, on her dreams, feel guilty, make excuses and apologies. Now what was tiring had disappeared, and only beauty remained. Saturday found him for the first time strolling alone through Zurich, breathing in the heady smell of his freedom. New adventures hid around each corner. The future was again a secret. He was on his way back to the bachelor life, the life he had once felt destined for, the life that would let him be what he actually was. For 7 years he had lived bound to her, his every step subject to her scrutiny. She might as well have chained iron balls to his ankles. Suddenly his step was much lighter. He soared. He had entered Paramenides' magical field. He was enjoying the sweet lightness of being. Did he feel like phoning Sabina in Geneva, contacting one or another of the women he had met during his several months in Zurich? No, not in the least. Perhaps he sensed that any woman would make his memory of Teresa unbearably painful. 15. This curious melancholic fascination lasted until Sunday evening. On Monday everything changed. Teresa forced his way into his thoughts. He imagined her sitting there, writing her farewell letter. He felt her hands trembling. He saw her lugging her heavy suitcase in one hand and leading Karenin on his leash with the other. He pictured her unlocking their Prague flat and suffered the utter abandonment breathing her in the face as she opened the door. During those 2 beautiful days of melancholy, his compassion, that curse of emotional telepathy, had taken a holiday. It had slept around Sunday sleep of a miner who, after a hard week's work, needs to gather strength for his Monday shift. Instead of the patients he was treating, Tomas now saw Teresa. He tried to remind himself, don't think about her, don't think about her. He said to himself, I'm sick with compassion. It's good that she's gone and I'll never see her again, though it's not Teresa I need to be free of. It's that sickness, compassion, which I thought I was immune to until she infected me with it. On Saturday and Sunday he felt the sweet lightness of being rise up to him out of the depths of the future. On Monday he was hit by a weight like likes of which he had never known. The tons of steel of the Russian tanks were nothing compared with it, for there is nothing heavier than compassion. Not even one's own pain weighs so heavy as the pain one feels with someone, for someone, a pain intensified by the imagination and prolonged by 100 echoes. He kept warning himself not to give in to compassion, and to compassion listened with bowed head and a seemingly guilty conscience. Compassion knew it was being presumptuous, yet it quietly stood its ground, and on the 5th day after her departure, Tomas informed the director of his hospital, the man who had phoned him daily in Prague after the Russian invasion, that he had to return at once. He was ashamed. He knew that the move would appear irresponsible, inexcusable to the man. He thought to unbosom himself and tell him the story of Teresa and the letter she had left on the table for him, but in the end he did not. From the Swiss doctor's point of view, Teresa's move could only appear hysterical and abhorrent, and Tomas refused to allow anyone an opportunity to think ill of her. The director of the hospital was in fact offended. Tomas shrugged his shoulders and said, Es muss sein, es muss sein. It was an illusion. The last movement of Beethoven's last quartet is based on the following 2 motifs. Muss es sein, es muss sein, es muss sein. Must it be, it must be, it must be. To make the meaning of the words absolutely clear, Beethoven introduced the movement with the phrase Der schwer gefasste Entschluss, which is commonly translated as the difficult resolution. This allusion to Beethoven was actually Tomas's first step back to Teresa, because she was the one who had induced him to buy records of Beethoven quartets and sonatas. The illusion was even more pertinent than he thought, because the Swiss doctor was a great music lover. Smiling serenely, he asked, in the melody of Beethoven's motif, "Muss es sein?" "Ja, es muss sein," Thomas said again. Unlike Parmenides, Beethoven apparently viewed weight as something positive, since the German word schwer means both difficult and heavy. Beethoven's difficult resolution may also be considered as heavy or weighty resolution. The weighty resolution is at one with the voice of fate. Es muss sein, necessity, weight, and the value are three concepts inextricably bound. Only necessity is heavy, and only what is heavy has value. This is a conviction born of Beethoven's music, and although we cannot ignore the possibility, or even the probability, that it owes its origins more to Beethoven's commentators than to Beethoven himself, we all more or less share it. We believe that the greatness of man stems from the fact that he bears his fate, as Atlas bore the heavens on his shoulders. Beethoven's hero is a lifter of the metaphysical weights. Thomas approached the Swiss border. I imagine a gloomy, shock-headed Beethoven in person, conducting the local firemen's brass band in a farewell immigration, an Es muss sein march. Then Thomas crossed the Czech border and was welcomed by columns of Russian tanks. He had to stop his car and wait a half an hour before they passed. A terrifying soldier in the black uniform of the armed forces stood at the crossroads directing traffic as if every road in the country belonged to him and him alone. Es muss sein, Thomas repeated to himself. But then he began to doubt. Did it really have to be? Yes, it was unbearable for him to stay in Zurich, imagining Teresa living on her own in Prague. But how long would he have been tortured by compassion? All his life? A year? A month? Or only a week? How could he have known? How could he have gauged it? Any schoolboy can do experiments in the physics laboratory to test various scientific hypotheses. But man, because he has only one life to live, cannot conduct experiments to test whether to follow his passion, compassion, or not. It was with these thoughts in mind that he opened the door to his flat. Karenin made the homecoming easier by jumping up on him and licking his face. The desire to fall into Teresa's arms, he could still feel it while getting into his car in Zurich, had completely disintegrated. He fancied himself standing opposite her in the midst of a snowy plain, the two of them shivering from the cold. 17. From the very beginning of the occupation, Russian military airplanes had flown over Prague all night long. Thomas, no longer accustomed to the noise, was unable to fall asleep. Twisting and turning beside the slumbering Teresa, he recalled something she had told him a long time before in the course of an insignificant conversation. They had been talking about his friend Z when she announced, "If I hadn't met you, I'd certainly have fallen in love with him." Even then, her words had left Thomas in a strange state of melancholy, and now he realized it was only a matter of chance that Teresa loved him, and not his friend Z. Apart from her consummated love for Thomas, there were in the realm of possibility an infinite number of unconsummated loves for other men. We all reject out of hand the idea that the love of our life may be something light or weightless. We presume our love is what must be, that without it our life would no longer be the same. We feel that Beethoven himself, gloomy and awe-inspiring, is playing the Es muss sein to our own great love. Thomas often thought of Teresa's remark about his friend Z and came to the conclusion that the love story of his life exemplified not Es muss sein, it must be so, but rather Es könnte auch anders sein. It could just as well be otherwise. 7 years earlier, a complex neurological case happened to have been discovered at the hospital in Teresa's town. They called in the chief surgeon of Thomas's hospital in Prague for consultation, but the chief surgeon of Thomas's hospital happened to be suffering from sciatica. Because he could not move, he sent Thomas to the provincial hospital in his place. The town had several hotels, but Thomas happened to be given a room in the one where Teresa was employed. He happened to have had enough to read time before his train left to stop at the hotel restaurant. Teresa happened to be on duty, and he happened to be serving Thomas's table, and had taken 6 chance happenings to push Thomas towards Teresa, as if he had little inclination to go to her on his own. He had gone back to Prague because of her, so fateful a decision resting on so fortuitous a love that would not even have existed had it not been for the chief surgeon's sciatica 7 years earlier, and that woman, that personification of absolute fortuity, now again lay asleep beside him, breathing deeply. It was late at night. His stomach started acting up, as it tended to do in times of physic stress. Once or twice her breathing turned to mild snores. Tomas felt no compassion. All he felt was the pressure in his stomach and the despair of having returned. Part 2. Soul and Body 1. It would be senseless for the author to try and convince the reader that his characters once actually lived. They were not born of a mother's womb. They were born of stimulating phrase or two, or from a basic situation. Tomas was born of the saying, "Inimal est kinimal." Teresa was born of the rumbling of his stomach. The first time she went to Tomas's flat, her insides began to rumble, and no wonder. She had nothing to eat since breakfast but a quick sandwich on the platform before boarding the train. She had concentrated on the daring journey ahead of her, and had forgotten about food. But when we ignore the body, we are more easily victimized by it. She felt terrible standing there in front of Tomas, listening to her belly speak out. She felt like crying. Fortunately, after the first 10 seconds, Tomas put his arms around her and made her forget her ventral voices. 2. Teresa was therefore born of a situation which brutally reveals the irreconcilable duality of body and soul, that fundamental human experience. A long time ago, man would listen in amazement to the sound of regular beats in his chest, never suspecting what they were. He was unable to identify himself with so alien and unfamiliar an object as the body. The body was a cage, and inside the cage was something which looked, listened, feared, thought, and marveled. That something, that remainder left over after the body had been accounted for, was the soul. Today, of course, the body is no longer unfamiliar. We know that beating in our chest is the heart, and that the nose is the nozzle of a hose sticking out of the body to take oxygen to the lungs. The face is nothing but an instrument panel registering all the body mechanisms: digestion, sight, hearing, respiration, thought. Ever since man has learned to give each part of the body a name, the body has given him less trouble. He has also learned that the soul is nothing more than the gray matter of the brain in action. The old duality of body and soul has become shrouded in scientific terminology, and we can laugh at it as merely as an obsolete prejudice. But just make someone who has fallen in love listen to his stomach rumble, and the unity of body and soul, that lyrical illusion of age and science, instantly fades away. 3. Teresa tried to see herself through her body. That is why, from girlhood on, she would stand before the mirror so often, and because she was so afraid her mother would catch her at it. Every peek into the mirror had a tinge of secret vice. It was not vanity that drew her to the mirror. It was amazement at seeing her own eye. She forgot she was looking at the instrumental panel of her body mechanisms. She thought she saw her soul shining through the features of her face. She forgot that the nose was merely the nozzle of a hose that took oxygen to the lungs. She saw it as a true expression of her nature. Staring at herself for long stretches of time, she was occasionally upset at the sight of her mother's features in her face. She would stare all the more doggedly at her image in an attempt to wish them away and keep only what was hers alone. Each time she succeeded was a time of intoxication. Her soul would rise to the surface of her body like a crew charging out from the bowels of a ship, spreading out over the deck, waving at the sky and singing in jubilation. 4. She took after her mother, and not only physically. I sometimes have the feeling that her entire life was merely a continuation of her mother's, which was much as the course of a ball on a billiard table is merely the continuation of the player's arm movement. Where and when did it begin? The movement that later turned into Teresa's life. Perhaps it was at the time when Teresa's grandfather, a proud businessman, began extolling the beauty of his daughter, Teresa's mother, for all to hear. When she was 3 or 4, he would tell her she was the image of Raphael's Madonna. Teresa's 4-year-old mother never forgot it. When, as an adolescent, she sat at her desk at school, she would not listen to the teachers. She would think about which paintings she was like. Then came the time for her to marry. She had 9 suitors. They all knelt around her in a circle. Standing in the middle, like a princess, she did not know which one to choose. One was the handsomest, another wittiest, the third the richest, the fourth the most athletic, the fifth from the best family, the sixth recited verse, the seventh traveled widely, the eighth played the violin, and the ninth was the most manly. But they all knelt in the same way. They had the same calluses on their knees. The reason she finally chose the ninth was not so much that he was most manly of all, as that when she whispered, "Be careful, very careful," to him during their love-making, he was purposefully careless, and she had to marry him after failing to find a doctor willing to perform an abortion, and so Teresa was born. Numerous relatives gathered from all corners of the country to lean over the pram and talk baby talk. Teresa's mother talked no baby talk. She did not talk at all. She thought about the 8 other suitors, all of whom seemed better than the 9th. Like her daughter, Teresa's mother frequently looked in the mirror. One day she discovered wrinkles near her eyes and decided her marriage made no sense. At about that time she met an unmanly man who had several charges of fraud on his record, not to mention 2 failed marriages. Now she hated those suitors with her calloused knees. She had a passionate desire to be won to kneel for a change. She went down on her knees before her new swindler friend, left her husband and Teresa to fend for themselves. The most manly of men became the most downcast. He became so downcast that nothing meant anything to him any more. He said openly what was on his mind, and the communist police, shocked by his rash statements, arrested him, brought him to trial, and sentenced him to a long term in prison. They closed up his flat and sent Teresa to stay with her mother. The most downcast of men died after a short spell behind bars, and Teresa and her mother went to live in a small town near the mountains with her mother's swindler. The swindler worked in an office, her mother in a shop. Her mother also gave birth to 3 or more children. Then she looked in the mirror again and discovered she was old and ugly. 5. When she realized she had lost everything, she initiated a search for the culprit. Anyone would do. Her first husband, manly and unloved, who had failed to heed her whispered warning. Her second husband, manly and unmanly and much loved, who had dragged away from Prague to a small town and kept her in a state of permanent jealousy by going through one woman after another. When she was powerless against either, the only person who belonged to her and had no means of escape, the hostage who could do penance for all the culprits, was Teresa. Indeed, was she not the principal culprit, determining her mother's fate? She, the absurd encounter of the sperm of the most manly of men and the egg of the most beautiful of women? Yes, it was that fateful second, which was named Teresa, that the botched long-distance race her mother's life had begun. Teresa's mother never stopped reminding her that being a mother meant sacrificing everything. Her words had the ring of truth, backed as they were by the experience of a woman who had lost everything because of her child. Teresa would listen and believe that being a mother was the highest value in life and that being a mother was a great sacrifice. If a mother was sacrifice personified, then a daughter was guilt, with no possibility of redress. 6. Of course, Teresa did not know the story of the night when her mother whispered, "Be careful," into the ear of her father. Her guilty conscience was as vague as original sin, but she did what she could to rid herself of it. Her mother took her out of school at the age of 15, and Teresa went to work as a waitress, handing over all her earnings. She was willing to do anything to gain her mother's love. She ran the household, took care of her siblings, spent all day on Sunday cleaning house and doing the family wash. It was a pity because she was the brightest in her class. She yearned for something higher, but in the small town there was nothing higher for her. Whenever she did the clothes, she kept a book next to the tub. As she turned the pages, the wash water dripped all over them. At home there was no such thing as shame. Her mother marched about the flat in her underwear, sometimes braless and sometimes on summer days stark naked. Her stepfather did not walk about naked, but he did go into the bathroom every time Teresa was in the bath. Once she locked herself in, and her mother was furious. "Who do you think you are anyway? Do you think he's going to bite off a piece of your beauty?" This confrontation shows clearly that hatred for her daughter outweighed suspicion of her husband. Her daughter's guilt was infinite and included the husband's infidelities. Teresa's desire to be emancipated and insist on her rights, like the right to lock herself in a bathroom, was more objectionable to Teresa's mother than the possibility of her husband's taking a prurient interest in Teresa. Once her mother decided to go naked in the winter when the lights were on, Teresa quickly ran to the curtains so that no one would see her from across the street. She heard her mother's laughter behind her. The following day her mother had some friends over, a neighbor, a woman she worked with, a local school mistress, and 2 or 3 other women in the habit of getting together regularly. Teresa and the 16-year-old son of one of them came in at the point to say hello, and her mother immediately took advantage of their presence to tell how Teresa had tried to protect her mother's modesty. She laughed, and all the women laughed with her. "Teresa can't reconcile herself to the idea that the human body pees and farts," she said. Teresa turned bright red, but her mother would not stop. "What's so terrible about that?" And in answer to her own question, she broke wind loudly. All the women laughed again. 7. Teresa's mother blew her nose noisily, talked to people in public about her sex life, and enjoyed demonstrating her false teeth. She was remarkably skillful at loosening them with her tongue. And in the midst of a broad smile, would cause the uppers to drop down over the lowers in such a way as to give her face a sinister expression. Her behavior was but of a single grand gesture of casting off of youth and beauty. In the days when she had 9 suitors kneeling around her in a circle, she guarded her nakedness apprehensively, as though trying to express the value of her body in terms of the modesty she accorded it. Now she had not only lost that modesty, she had radically broken with it, ceremoniously using her new immodesty to draw a dividing line through her life and proclaim that youth and beauty were overrated and worthless. Teresa appears to me a continuation of the gesture in which her mother cast her off life as a young beauty, cast it far behind her. And if Teresa has a nervous way of moving, if her gestures lack a certain easy grace, we must not be surprised. Her mother's grand, wild, and self-destructive gesture has left an indelible imprint on her. 8. Teresa's mother demanded justice. She wanted to see the culprit penalized. That is why she insisted her daughter remain with her in the world of immodesty, where youth and beauty mean nothing, where the world is nothing but a vast concentration camp of bodies, one like the next, with souls invisible. Now we can better understand the meaning of Teresa's secret vice, her long looks and frequent glances in the mirror. It was a battle with her mother. It was longing to be a body unlike other bodies, to find that the surface of her face reflected the crew of the soul, charging up from below. It was not an easy task, her soul, her sad, timid, self-effacing soul, lay concealed in the depths of her bowels and was ashamed to show itself. So it was the day she first met Tomas, weaving its way through the drunks in the hotel restaurant. Her body sagged under the weight of the beers on the tray, and her soul lay somewhere on the level of the stomach or the pancreas. Then Tomas called to her. That call meant a great deal, because it came from someone who knew neither her mother nor the drunks with their daily stereotypically scabrous remarks. His outsider status raised him above the rest. Something else raised him above the others as well. He had an open book on the table. No one ever opened a book in that restaurant before. In Teresa's eyes, books were the emblems of a secret brotherhood, for she had but a single weapon against the world of crudity surrounding her. The books she took out of the municipal library, and above all, the novels. She had read any number of them, from Fielding to Thomas Mann. They not only offered the possibility of an imaginary escape from a life she found unsatisfying, they also had a meaning for her as physical objects. She loved to walk down the street with a book under her arm. It had the same significance for her as an elegant cane for the dandy a century ago. It differentiated her from others. Comparing the book to the elegant cane of the dandy is not absolutely precise. The dandy's cane did more than make him different. It made him modern and up-to-date. The book made Teresa different but old-fashioned. Of course, she was too young to see how old-fashioned she looked to others. The young men walking by with transistor radios pressed to their ears seemed silly to her. It never occurred to her that they were modern. And so the man who called to her was simultaneously a stranger and a member of the secret brotherhood. He called to her in a kind voice, and Teresa felt her soul rushing up to the surface through her blood vessels and pores to show itself to him. 9. After Tomas had returned to Prague from Zurich, he began to feel uneasy at the thought that his acquaintance with Teresa was the result of 6 improbable fortuities. But it's not an event-effect more significant and noteworthy, the greater the number of fortuities necessary to bring it about. Chance and chance alone has a message for us. Everything that occurs out of necessity, everything expected, repeated day in, day out, is mute. Only chance can speak to us. We read its message as much as gypsies read the images made by coffee grounds at the bottom of a cup. Tomas appeared to Teresa in the hotel restaurant as chance in the absolute. There he sat, poring over an open book, when suddenly he raised his eyes to her, smiled, and said, "A cognac, please." At that moment, the radio happened to be playing music. On her way behind the counter to pour the cognac, Teresa turned the volume up. She recognized Beethoven. She had known this music from the time a string quartet from Prague had visited their town. Teresa, who, as we know, yearned for something higher, went to the concert. The hall was nearly empty. The only other people in the audience were the local pharmacist and his wife, and although the quartet of musicians on stage faced only a trio of spectators down below, they were kind enough not to cancel the concert and gave a private performance of the last 3 Beethoven quartets. Then the pharmacist invited the musicians to dinner and asked the girl in the audience to come along with them. From then on, Beethoven became her image of the world on the other side, the world she yearned for. Rounding the corner with Tomas's cognac, she tried to read Chance's message. How was it possible that at the very moment she was taking an order of cognac to a stranger she found attractive, at that very moment she heard Beethoven? Necessity knows no magic formulae. They are all left to chance. If a love is to be unforgettable, fortuities must immediately start fluttering down to it like birds to Francis of Assisi's shoulders. 10. He called her back to pay for the cognac. He closed his book, the emblem of the secret brotherhood, and she thought of asking him what he was reading. "Can you have it charged to my room?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What number are you in?" He showed her his key, which was attached to a piece of wood with a red 6 drawn on it. "That's odd," she said. "6. What's so odd about that?" he asked. She had suddenly recalled that the house where they had lived in Prague before her parents were divorced was number 6, but she answered something else, which would make credit to her wiles. "You're in room 6. My shift ends at 6. "Well, my train leaves at 7, said the stranger. She did not know how to respond, so she gave him the bill for his signature and took it over to the reception desk. When she finished her work, the stranger was no longer at his table. Had he understood her discreet message? She left the restaurant in a state of excitement. Opposite the hotel was a barren little park, as wretched as the only park of a dirty little town can be, but for Teresa it had always been an island of beauty. It had grass, 4 poplars, branches, a weeping willow, and a few forsythia bushes. She was sitting on a yellow bench that afforded a clear view of the restaurant entrance, the very same bench she had sat on the day before with a book in her lap. She knew then the birds of fortuity had begun alighting on her shoulders, that this stranger was her fate. He called out to her, invited her to sit next to him. The crew of her soul rushed up to the deck of her body. Then she walked into the station, and he gave her his card as a farewell gesture. "If you ever should happen to come to Prague, 11. Much more than the card he slipped her at the last minute. It was the call of all those fortuities, the book, Beethoven, the number 6, the yellow park bench, which gave her the courage to leave home and change her fate. It may well be those few fortuities, quite modest by the way, even drab, just what one might expect from so lackluster a town, which set her love in motion and provided her with a source of energy she had not yet exhausted at the end of her days. Our day-to-day life is bombarded with fortuities, or to be more precise, with the accidental meetings of people and events we call coincidences. Coincidence means that 2 events unexpectedly happen at the same time they meet. Tomas appears in the hotel restaurant at the same time the radio is playing Beethoven. We do not even notice the great majority of such coincidences. If the seat Tomas occupied had been occupied instead by the local butcher, Teresa would never have noticed the radio was playing Beethoven, though the meeting of Beethoven and butcher would have also been an interesting coincidence. But her nascent love inflamed her sense of beauty, and she would never forget that music. Whenever she heard it, she would be touched. Everything going on around her at that moment would be haloed by the music and take on its beauty. Early in the novel, Teresa clutched under her arm when she went to visit Tomas. Anna meets Vronsky. In a curious circumstances, they are at the railway station when someone is run over by a train. At the end of the novel, Anna throws herself under the train. The symmetrical composition, the same motif, appears at the beginning and at the end. It may seem quite novelistic to you, and I am willing to agree, but only on condition that you refrain from reading such notion as fictive, fabricated, and untrue to life into the word novelistic, because human lives are composed in precisely such a fashion. They are composed like music. Guided by a sense of beauty, an individual transforms a fortuitous occurrence, Beethoven's music, death under a train, into a motif, which then assumes a permanent place in the composition of the individual's life. Anna could have chosen another way to take her life, but the motif of death and the railway station, unforgettably bound to the birth of love, enticed her in her hour of despair with its dark beauty. Without realizing it, the individual composes his life according to the laws of beauty, even in times of greatest distress. It is wrong then to chide the novel for being fascinated by mysterious coincidences like the meeting of Anna Vronsky, the railway station, the death or the meeting of Beethoven, Tomas, Teresa, and the cognac. But it is right to chide man for being blind to such coincidences in his daily life, for he thereby deprives his life of a dimension of beauty. 12. Impelled by the birds of fortuity fluttering down on her shoulders, she took a week's leave, and without a word to her mother, boarded the train to Prague. During the journey she made frequent trips to the toilet, to look in the mirror and beg her soul not to abandon the deck of her body for a moment on this most crucial day of her life. Scrutinizing herself on one such trip, she had a sudden scare. She felt a scratch in her throat. Could she be coming down with something on this most crucial day of her life? But there was no turning back, so she phoned him from the station, and the moment he opened the door, her stomach started rumbling terribly. She was mortified. She felt as though she were carrying her mother in her stomach, and her mother had guffawed, despoiled her meeting with Tomas. For the first few seconds she was afraid he would throw her out because of the crude noises she was making. But then he put his arms around her. She was grateful to him for ignoring her rumbles, and kissed him passionately, her eyes misting. Before the first minute was up, they were making love. She screamed while making love. She had a fever by then. She had come down with the flu. The nozzle of the hose supplying oxygen to the lungs was stuffed and red. When she travelled to Prague a second time, it was with a heavy suitcase. She had packed all her things, determined never again to return to the small town. He had invited her to come to his place the following evening. That night she had slept in a cheap hotel. In the morning she carried her heavy suitcase to the station, left it there, and roamed the streets of Prague the whole day with Anna Karenina under her arm. Not even after she rang the doorbell and opened the door would she part with it. It was like a ticket to Tomas's world. She realized that she had nothing but that miserable ticket, and the thought that brought her nearly to tears. To keep from crying, she talked too much and too loudly, and she laughed. And again he took her in his arms almost at once, and they made love. She had entered a mist in which nothing could be seen, and only her scream could be heard. 13. It was no sigh, no moan, it was a real scream. She screamed so hard that Tomas had to turn his head away from her face, afraid that her voice so close to his ear would rupture his eardrum. The scream was not an expression of sensuality. Sensuality is the total mobilization of the senses. An individual observes his partner intently, straining to catch every sound, but her scream aimed at crippling the senses, preventing all seeing and hearing. What was screaming, in fact, was the naive idealism of her love, trying to banish all contradictions, banish the duality of body and soul, banish perhaps even time. Were her eyes closed? No. But they were not looking anywhere. She kept them fixed on the void of the ceiling. At times she twisted her head violently from side to side. When the scream died down, she fell asleep at his side, clutching his hand. She held his hand all night. Even at the age of 8, she would fall asleep by pressing one hand into the other and making believe she was holding the hand of the man whom she loved, the man of her life. So if in her sleep she pressed Tomas's hand with such tenacity, we can understand why. She had been training for it since childhood. 14. A young woman forced to keep drunks supplied with beer and siblings with clean underwear. Instead of being allowed to peruse something higher, stores up great reserves of vitality, a vitality never dreamed of by university students yawning over their books. Teresa had read a good deal more than they, and learned a good deal more about life, but she would never realize it. The difference between the university graduate and the autodidact lies not so much in the extent of knowledge as in the extent of vitality and self-confidence, the elan, with which Teresa flung herself into her new Prague existence was both frenzied and precarious. She seemed to be expecting someone to come up to her any day and say, "What are you doing here? Go back to where you belong." All her eagerness for life hung by a thread. Tomas's voice, for it was Tomas's voice that had once coaxed forth her timorous soul from its hiding place in her bowels. Teresa had a job in a dark room, but it was not enough for her. She wanted to take pictures, not develop them. Tomas's friend Sabina lent her 3 or 4 monographs of famous photographers. They invited her to a cafe and explained over the open books what made each of the pictures interesting. Teresa listened with silent concentration, the kind few professors ever glimpse on their students' faces, thanks to Sabina. She came to understand the ties between photography and painting, and she made Tomas take her to every exhibit that opened in Prague. Before long, she was placing her own pictures in the illustrated weekly where she worked. Finally, she left the dark room for the staff of professional photographers. On the evening of that day, she and Tomas went out to the bar with friends to celebrate her promotion. Everyone danced. Tomas began to mope. Back at home, after some prodding from Teresa, he admitted that he had been jealous watching her dance with a colleague of his. "You mean you were really jealous?" she asked him then, 10 times or more, incredulously, as though someone had just informed her that she had been awarded a Nobel Prize. Then she put her arm around his waist and began dancing across the room. The step she used was not the one she had shown off in the bar. It was more like a village polka, a wild romp that sent her legs flying in the air and her torso bouncing all over the room with Tomas in tow. Before long, unfortunately, she began to be jealous herself, and Tomas saw her jealousy not as a Nobel Prize, but as a burden he would be saddled with until not long before his death. "15. While she marched around the pool naked with a large group of other naked women, Tomas stood over them in a basket hanging from the pool's arched roof, shouting at them, making them sing and do knee bends. The moment one of them did a faulty knee bend, he would shoot her. Let me return to this dream. Its horror did not begin with Tomas's first pistol shot. It was horrifying from the outset. Marching naked in formation with a group of naked women was for Teresa the quintessential image of horror. When she lived at home, her mother forbade her to lock the bathroom door. What she meant by her injunction was, "Your body is just like all other bodies. You have no right to shame. You have no reason to hide something that exists in millions of identical copies." In her mother's world, all bodies were the same, and marched behind one another in formation. Since childhood, Teresa had seen nudity as a sign of concentration camp uniformity, a sign of humiliation. There was yet another horror at the very beginning of the dream. All the women had to sing. Not only were their bodies identically worthless, not only were their bodies mere resounding soulless mechanisms, the women rejoiced over it. Theirs was the joyful solidarity of the soulless. The women were pleased at having thrown off the ballast of the soul, the laughable conceit, the illusion of uniqueness, to become one like the rest. Teresa sang with them, but did not rejoice. She sang because she was afraid that if she did not sing, the women would kill her. But what was the meaning of the fact that Tomas shot at them, toppling one after another into the pool dead? The women, overjoyed by their sameness, their lack of diversity, were in fact celebrating their imminent demise, which would render the sameness absolute. So Tomas's shots were merely a joyful climax to their morbid march. After every report of his pistol, they burst into joyous laughter, and as each corpse sank beneath the surface, they sang even louder. But why was Tomas the one doing the shooting, and why was he out to shoot Teresa with the rest of them? Because he was the one who sent Teresa to join them. That was what the dream was meant to tell Tomas, what Teresa was unable to tell him herself. She had come to him to escape her mother's world, a world where all bodies were equal. She had come to him to make her body unique, irreplaceable, but he too had drawn an equal sign between her and the rest of them. He kissed them all alike, stroked them all alike, made absolutely no distinction between Teresa's body and the other bodies. He had sent her back into the world she tried to escape, sent her to march naked with the other naked women. 16. She would dream 3 series of dreams in succession. The first was a cat's going berserk and referred to the sufferings she had gone through in her lifetime. The second was of images of her execution and came in countless variations. The third was of her life after death, when humiliation turned into a never-ending state. The dreams left nothing to be deciphered. The accusation they leveled at Tomas was so clear that his only reaction was to hang his head and stroke her hand without a word. The dreams were eloquent. They were also beautiful. That aspect seemed to have escaped Freud in his theory of dreams. Dreaming is not merely an act of communication, or coded communication if you like. It is also an aesthetic activity, a game of the imagination, a game that has a value in itself. Our dreams prove that to imagine, to dream about things that have not happened, is among mankind's deepest needs. Herein lies the danger. If dreams were not beautiful, they would quickly be forgotten, but Teresa kept coming back to her dreams, running through them in her mind, turning them into legends. Tomas lived under the hypnotic spell cast by the excruciating beauty of Teresa's dreams. "Dear Teresa, sweet Teresa, what am I losing you to?" he once said to her as they sat face to face in a wine cellar. "Every night you dream of death, as if you really wished to quit this world." It was day. Reason and willpower were back in place. A drop of red wine ran slowly down her glass as she answered, "There's nothing I can do about it, Tomas. Oh, I understand. I know you love me. I know your infidelities are no great tragedy." She looked at him with love in her eyes. But she feared the night ahead, feared her dreams. Her life was split. Both day and night were competing for her. 17. Anyone whose goal is something higher must expect some day to suffer vertigo. But what is vertigo? Fear of falling? Then why do we feel it, even when the observation tower comes equipped with a sturdy handrail? No, vertigo is something other than the fear of falling. It is the voice of the emptiness below us which tempts and lures us. It is the desire to fall, against which, terrified, we defend ourselves. The naked women marching around the swimming pool, the corpses in the hearse, rejoicing that she too is dead. These were the down below that she had feared, and fled once before, but which mysteriously beckoned her. These were the vertigo. She heard a sweet, almost joyous summons to renounce her fate and soul. The solidarity of the soul is calling her, and in times of weakness she was ready to heed the call and return to her mother. She was ready to dismiss the crew of her soul from the deck of her body, ready to descend to a place among her mother's friends and laugh when one of them broke wind noisily, ready to march around the pool naked with them and sing. 18. True, Teresa fought with her mother until the day she left home, but let us not forget that she never stopped loving her. She would have done anything for her mother had asked in a loving voice. The only reason she found the strength to leave was that she never heard that voice. When Teresa's mother realized that her aggressiveness was no longer having any power over her daughter, she started writing her querulous letters, complaining about her husband, her boss, her health, her children, and assuring Teresa that she was the only person left in her life. Teresa thought that at last, after 20 years, she was hearing the voice of her mother's love, and felt like going back, all the more because she felt so weak, so debilitated by Tomas's infidelities, they exposed her powerlessness, which in turn led to vertigo, the insuperable longing to fall. One day her mother phoned to say that she had cancer and only a few months to live. The news transformed into rebellion. Teresa's despair at Tomas's infidelity. She had betrayed her mother, she told herself reproachfully. And for a man who did not love her, she was willing to forget everything her mother had done to torture her. She was in a position to understand her now. They were in the same situation. Her mother loved her stepfather just as Teresa loved Tomas, and her stepfather tortured her mother with his infidelities just as Tomas galled her with his. The cause of her mother's malice was that she had suffered so. Teresa told Tomas that her mother was ill and that she would be taking a week off to go see her. Her voice was full of spite. Sensing that real reason calling back to her mother was vertigo, Tomas opposed the trip. He rang up the hospital in the small town. Meticulous records of the incidents of cancer were kept throughout the country, so he had no trouble finding out that Teresa's mother had never been suspected of having the disease, nor had she even seen a doctor for over a year. Teresa obeyed Tomas and did not go to visit her mother. Several hours after the decision, she fell in the street and injured her knee. She began to teeter as she walked, fell almost daily, bumped into things, or at the very least dropped objects. She was in the grip of an insuperable longing to fall. She lived in a constant state of vertigo. "Pick me up" is the message of a person who keeps falling. Tomas kept picking her up patiently. 19. I want to make love to you in my studio. It will be like a stage surrounded by people. The audience won't be allowed up close, but they won't be able to take their eyes off us. As time passed, the image lost some of its original cruelty and began to excite Teresa. She would whisper the details to him while they made love. Then it occurred to her that there might be a way to avoid the condemnation she saw in Tomas's infidelities. All he had to do was take her along, take her with him, when he went to see his mistress. Maybe then her body would again become the first and only among the others. Her body would become his second, his assistant, his alter ego. "I'll undress them for you, give them a bath, bring them in to you," she would whisper to him. As they pressed together, she yearned for the two of them to merge into a hermaphrodite. Then the other women's bodies would be their playthings. 20. Oh, to be the alter ego of his polygamous life. Tomas refused to understand, but she could not get it out of her head, and tried to cultivate her friendship with Sabina. Teresa began by offering to do a series of photographs of Sabina. Sabina invited Teresa to her studio, and at last she saw the spacious room and its centerpiece, the large square platform-like bed. "I feel awful that you've never been here before," said Sabina, as she showed her the pictures leaning against the wall. She even pulled out an old canvas of steelworks under construction, which she had done during her school days, a period when the strictest realism had been required of all students. Art was not realistic, was said to sap the foundations of socialism. In the spirit of the wager of the times, she had tried to be stricter than her teachers, and had painted in a style concealing the brushstrokes and closely resembling of color photography. "Here is a painting I happened to drip red paint on. At first I was terribly upset, and then I started enjoying it. The trickle looked like a crack, and it turned into a building site, into a battered old backdrop. A backdrop with a building site painted on it. I began playing with the crack, filling it out, wondering what might be visible behind it, and that's how I began my first cycle of paintings. I called it Behind the Scenes. Of course I couldn't show them to anybody. I'd have been kicked out of the academy. On the surface there was always an impeccably realistic world, but underneath, behind the backdrop's cracked canvas, lurked something different, something mysterious or abstract." After pausing for a moment, she added, "On the surface, as an intelligible lie. Underneath, the unintelligible truth." Teresa listened to her with a remarkable concentration that few professors ever see on the face of a student, and began to perceive that all Sabina's paintings, past and present, did indeed treat the same idea, and that they all featured the confluence of two themes, two worlds, that they were all double exposures, so to speak. A landscape showing an old-fashioned table lamp shining through it, an idyllic still life of apples, nuts, and a tiny candlelit Christmas tree, showing a hand rippling through the canvas. She felt a rush of admiration for Sabina, and because Sabina treated her as a friend, it was an admiration free of fear and suspicion, and quickly turned into friendship. She nearly forgot she had come to take photographs. Sabina had to remind her. Teresa finally looked away from the paintings, only to see the bed set in the middle of the room like a platform. 21. Next to the bed stood a small table, and on the table the model of the human head. Kind hairdressers put wigs on. Sabina's wig stand sported a bowler hat rather than a wig. "It used to belong to my grandfather," she said with a smile. It was the kind of hat, black, hard, round, that Teresa had seen only on the screen, the kind that Chaplin wore. She smiled back, picked it up, and after studying it for a time, said, "Would you like me to take your picture in it?" Sabina laughed for a long time at the idea. Teresa put down the bowler hat, picked up her camera, and started taking pictures. When she had been at it for almost an hour, she suddenly said, "What would you say to some nude shots?" "Nude shots?" Sabina laughed. "Yes," Teresa said, repeating her proposal more boldly. "Nude shots." "That calls for a drink," said Sabina, and opened a bottle of wine. Teresa felt her body going weak. She was suddenly tongue-tied. Sabina, meanwhile, strode back and forth, wine in hand, going on about her grandfather who had been the mayor of a small town. Sabina had never known him. All he left behind was this bowler hat and a picture showing a raised platform with several small-town dignitaries on it. One of them was grandfather. It wasn't at all that clear that they were doing up there on the platform. Maybe they were officiating at some ceremony, unveiling a monument to fellow dignitary who had also once worn a bowler hat at public ceremonies. Sabina went on and on about the bowler hat and her grandfather until, emptying her third glass, she said, "I'll be right back," and disappeared into the bathroom. She came out in her bathrobe. Teresa picked up her camera and put it to her eye. Sabina threw open the robe. 22. The camera served Teresa as both a mechanical eye through which to observe Tomas's mistress and a veil by which to conceal her face from her. It took Sabina some time before she could bring herself to slip out of the robe entirely. The situation she found herself in was proving a bit more difficult than she expected. After several minutes of posing, she went up to Teresa and said, "Now it's my time to take your picture. Strip." Sabina had heard the command "strip" so many times from Tomas that it was engraved in her memory. Thus Tomas's mistress had just given Tomas's command to Tomas's wife. The two women were joined by the same magic word. That was Tomas's way of unexpectedly turning an innocent conversation with a woman into an erotic situation. Instead of stroking, flattering, pleading, he would issue a command, issue it abruptly, unexpectedly, softly yet firmly and authoritatively, and at a distance. At such moments he never touched the woman as he was addressing. He often used it on Teresa as well, and even though he said it softly, even though he whispered it, it was a command, and obeying never failed to arouse her. Hearing the word now made her desire to obey even stronger, because doing a stranger's bidding is a special madness, a madness all the more heady in this case because the command came not from a man but from a woman. Sabina took the camera from her, and Teresa took off her clothes. There she stood before Sabina, naked and disarmed, literally disarmed. Deprived of the apparatus she had been using to cover her face and aim at Sabina like a weapon, she was completely at the mercy of Tomas's mistress. This beautiful submission intoxicated Teresa. She wished that the moments she stood naked opposite Sabina would never end. I think that Sabina too felt the strange enchantment of the situation, her lover's wife standing oddly compliant and timorous before her. But after clicking the shutter 2 or 3 times, almost frightened by the enchantment and eager to dispel it, she burst into loud laughter. Teresa followed suit, and the two of them got dressed. 23. All previous crimes of the Russian Empire had been committed over the cover of a discreet shadow. The deportation of 1,000,000 Lithuanians, the murder of hundreds of thousands of Poles, the liquidation of the Crimean Tartars remain in our memory, but no photographic documentation exists. Sooner or later they will therefore be proclaimed as fabrications. Not so the 1968 invasion of the Czechoslovakia, of which both stills and motion pictures are stored in the archives throughout the world. Czech photographers and cameramen were actually aware that they were the ones who could best do the only thing left to do, preserve the face of violence for the distant future. 7 days in a row, Teresa roamed the streets photographing Russian soldiers and officers in compromising situations. The Russians did not know what to do. They had been carefully briefed on how to behave if someone fired at them or threw stones, but they had received no directives about what to do when someone aimed a lens. She shot roll after roll and gave about half of them underdeveloped to foreign journalists. The borders were still open, and reporters passing through were grateful for any kind of document. Many of her photographs turned up in the Western press. They were pictures of tanks, of threatening fists, of houses destroyed, of corpses covered with blood-stained red and white blue check flags, of young men on motorcycles racing full speed around the tanks and waving check flags on long staffs, of young girls in unbelievably short skirts provoking the miserably sexually famished Russian soldiers by kissing random passerby before their eyes. As I have said, the Russian invasion was not only a tragedy, it was a carnival of hate, filled with a curious and no longer explicable euphoria. 24. She took some 50 prints with her to Switzerland, prints she had made herself with all the care and skill she could muster. She offered them to a high-circulation illustrated magazine. The editor gave her a kind of reception. All Czechs still wore the halo of their misfortune, and the good Swiss were touched. He offered her a seat, looked through the prints, praised them, and explained that because a certain time had elapsed since the events, There hadn't been the slightest chance. No, they aren't very... Not that they aren't very beautiful at being published. But it's not even over yet in Prague, she protested, and tried to explain to him in her bad German that at this very moment, even the country occupied, with everything against them, workers' councils were forming the factories, the students were going out on strike demanding the departure of the Russians, and the whole country was saying aloud what it thought. That's what's so unbelievable, and nobody here cares anymore. The editor was glad when an energetic woman came into the office and interrupted the conversation. The woman handed him a folder and said, "Here's the nudist speech article." The editor was delicate enough to fear that a Czech who photographed tanks would find pictures of naked people on a beach frivolous. He laid the folder at the far end of the desk and quickly said to the woman, "How would you like to meet a Czech colleague of yours? She'd brought me some marvelous pictures." The woman shook Teresa's hand and picked up her photographs. "Have a look at mine in the meantime," she said. Teresa leaned over to the folder and took out the pictures. Almost apologetically, the editor said to Teresa, "Of course they're completely different from your pictures." "Not at all," said Teresa. "They're the same." Neither the editor nor the photographer understood her, and even I find it difficult to explain what she had in mind when she compared a nude beach to the Russian invasion. Looking through the pictures, she stopped for a time at one that showed a family of four standing in a circle, a naked mother leaning over her children, her giant hanging low like a goat or a cow's, and the husband leaning the same way on the other side, his looking very much like an udder in miniature. "You don't like them, do you?" asked the editor. "They're good photographs." "She's shocked by this subject matter," said the woman. "I can just tell by looking at you that you'd never set foot on a nude beach." "No," said Teresa. The editor smiled. "You can see how easy it is to guess where you're from. The communist countries are awfully puritanical." "There's nothing wrong with the naked body," the woman said with maternal affection. "It's normal, and everything normal is beautiful." The image of her mother marching through the flat naked flashed through Teresa's mind. She could still hear the laughter behind her back when she ran and pulled the curtains to stop the neighbors from seeing her naked mother.